WorldStage is a premier event technology company. Now, I've worked with WorldStage before and have had nothing but stellar results. Their gear, their technology, and people are top-notch. Matt Ward is their Chief Technologist. He has been one of the people who has been on the forefront of developing event and especially LED technology. And most big shows, as you're all probably aware, are beginning to utilize that technology as a first choice for displays. Now, if you've ever seen a 20 by 100 foot wall of LED panels stacked together, especially from behind, you know that they are a sight to behold. A lot of work goes into engineering and creating and building them. And a lot of work has been done behind the scenes to develop them. Matt has been right in the middle of that. He's actually been publishing a series of articles on LinkedIn about light, projection, and LEDs, and that's actually what drew me in to interview him. Now, since technology has been evolving at the speed of light, especially lately, I had a lot I wanted to learn from Matt. Like, how does new evolving technology make its way into today's big events? What comes first? Is it like the technology or the need? It's kind of a chicken or an egg question. And also, how do you manage and execute a client's expectations and ideas with actual existing and evolving technology? Also, I wanted to know if he thought that changes brought on by COVID-19 will be good or bad for our industry? And is there more collaboration or competition within the tech industry to kind of move the ball forward? And what about AR and VR and XR and all those other Rs? Stick around for all that and more as we yak with Matt Ward.
Playback ending in 5.
Stand by fake music, stand by talent.
3, 2, 1. Clear.
Music go. Talent go. Welcome to Event Yak, where event pros share their stories about the past, present, and future. I'm your host, Terri Walters. Matt, thanks for joining me on Event Yak today. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks for having me.
It's a very exciting day for technologists. Today, SpaceX and NASA are launching the Falcon 9 rocket with 2 men inside of it, inside the Crew Dragon capsule. And we wish them Godspeed. Are you excited that we're going back into space?
Yeah, it's sort of abstract in the timing of it. Seeing people in space suits while you're seeing other news of medical professionals in sort of protective gear is a little bit strange. I think it used to be very abstract to see people all sort of suited up, and it sort of felt extraordinary. So it's a mix of kind of familiar and strange, but I think exploration for the sake of exploration, finding new ways to get people into space, finding ways to do more with that, it's all important work. So
I think a lot of big discoveries and inventions have come out of the space program. So I think that's important.
Well, I think you look at the ceramic tiles on the space shuttle, you look at all of the things that are marketed as having been created for NASA. It's easy to complain about spending. It's very easy to complain about military spending, but the byproducts of many of these things are really useful to us in daily life. The microchips, all sorts of materials advances. I wouldn't surprise me if laminated fabrics and things like that came out of sort of research for outer space. So, I think that's one of the big advantages of programs like that is it's not a business unit. Nobody did a market survey. They're taking risks and doing something because somewhere on the horizon they sense there's a thing there. And these are the steps you take to try and get there.
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting and edgy and new and unknown and risky, like you say, but I mean, that's how technology is. So, so you work at WorldStage and you're the Chief Technologist. What does that mean?
It's hard not to go into what I put in on my LinkedIn page because I think it's a bit funny, but I say 80% gist, 15% technology, and 5% unidentified filler. And obviously that's very tongue in cheek, and I think that chief technologists and creative technologists, we have a lot of new titles around for positions that people don't entirely understand, that didn't exist before. Chief Technology Officer used to be a relatively rare thing. I mean, most companies don't need a Chief Technology Officer. Now there's AV companies with Chief Technology Officers. I think it goes to how integral technology has become in executing our jobs, working for our clients, finding ways for them to fulfill a creative vision. And as much as Alico is still technology, as much as a lot of things that we used to do historically in theater and live entertainment involve technology. Certainly speaker design and even the steel used to build stadium tours. There's technology to all of this, but it was still a craft to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in most shows, there is equipment that if you open it up, in the middle of it is an integrated circuit, an application-specific integrated circuit, a FPGA, a piece of silicon that basically, if it's not working, there's nothing you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And in the oddest sense of things, that is technology. The stuff we understand, the stuff that looks familiar, the things that we have in our house that show up on shows is, not really looked at in the same way. And so I think I've forgotten what the question was, but I think that position in a company like WorldStage is about wrestling with that and trying to take these pieces of equipment that are almost entirely created for other industries and find ways to harness their potential in our industry, to create a moment on a Broadway show or do a product reveal or help somebody in a performance. And so we're adapting things for other people. And the best way for us to do that is to have a group of people, because it's never one person, who are filtering this information, looking for the interesting bits, trying to connect something from one news article to something you saw at a trade show last year, to a conversation you have with a client, to come up with something new. And I'm sort of in the center of that work, so which is a blast.
It's totally exciting. I mean, it's a great place to be these days, because everything is just evolving so fast. Do you find that? I mean, it seems like the application or the need comes first, or what comes first, the application or the need usually?
It's a loop. I really believe it's a loop. It's because there's the needs you can fulfill, there's the needs you can sort of fake. You can put something together that gives you some sense of that. And then there's the needs that you can't fulfill. The right mix of stuff does not exist to execute something. And the last bit is fodder for the development of applications. It just puts it on a list in your head that says somebody found this interesting, and you can't do it, but it's interesting. And it helps if you find the idea interesting too. But then sometimes 6 months later, or 3 years later, the right set of circumstances occur, the right advances have been made, or you've simply discovered a piece of information you didn't have, and you can suddenly offer something that is that approaches that need. And so you can create a new offering around that, hoping that it wasn't a passing fancy, that it's actually some sort of core requirement. And like so many things we do, sometimes you can't tell the difference between the two until you actually do it. And sometimes you do it and you realize that you can never get it perfect. That it actually requires sometimes taking something that should work and making it actually work in a reproducible way on a show site is just not going to happen.
Right.
And you have to accept that this is a parlor trick, and that you can show it at demos, but yeah, you kind of have to tell your clients, not there yet. So.
Yeah. I mean, I was reading the article, I think, that you just put out on LinkedIn about how, and I always say that I know just enough about technology to be dangerous. So I hung on through the article, but one of the things I took out of it was that, like you just said, having an idea and creating it is one thing, but then having it being able to be set up on site and scaled is like a totally different animal. How does that process actually happen? I mean, how long does that usually take? We've got this great idea, it looks really good, the client loves it, and now we need to like figure out how we're going to make it actually apply.
That depends. And in talking to Frederick, there was an interesting moment where so he had for Pop Mart, he had about 6 months, not really, probably 5 months and a week or something. And nobody had ever done anything like that before.
And just maybe some of my listeners did not catch your article, and hopefully they go back and look at it. Give me a little bit of background before you launch into that. Frederick is Frederick
Opsmer.
Okay.
He's a Belgian who started a company called System Technologies after coming out of the rental business. So Frederick was a guy who had worked on shows. He wasn't coming at this from an engineering company. He was coming at this from a user's point of view. Which I think in an instance like this is really critical. Because you can't take something from the lab to a show. Something that looks like it's super clever in a shop doesn't necessarily work on a show site, because you've made something too fiddly, because you don't realize the wear on loading in and loading out, in and loading out.
Right.
And so Pop Mart was this massive U2 tour. It followed Zoo TV, which was sort of a real step up in terms of the role of video in a show, video being a character in the show.
Okay.
Willie Williams had just done, I think, Sound and Vision for David Bowie, and that used a lot of projection, and he wanted to do something sort of with that, but obviously for U2 in whatever their sort of style of the moment was. And or Sound and Vision was right before Zoo TV. Anyway, he came up with this idea with Mark Fisher, this giant LED screen, which is a lovely idea, but nobody had done it before. Nobody had done like anything big like it before. Like 1996, when they started working on this, it was the first year in history, I think, when more than one company was making a color LED screen.
Okay.
Period.
Wow.
And these were small boxes. They were folded metal boxes that people would put together.
Right.
And the people putting them together were really smart, but this wasn't what they were expecting. This was a gigantic, low-res, stadium scale thing. And so for Frederick, 5.5 months or whatever to do that from, a standing start without the infrastructure, without people understanding signal distribution or mechanically what is required to put this all together. That's an incredibly compressed timescale. Yeah, I mean, it's great to have an opening date on a tour. That's a strong motivator.
Right.
But what I had said to Frederick on the call we had was that seemed like from the point of view of today, that seems like a luxury. And
Yes.
I was saying that in terms of how far LED has come and the fact that doing the Joshua Tree tour, which probably had a screen that was about the same size, was obviously much easier, even though he had to create a new mechanical system for that. All of the LED stuff, all of the electronics was really well understood. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. For things like this, anywhere from 12 weeks to 9 months, it depends on each project. But when you're doing something that hasn't been done before, you just need not just the time, but the ability to test out the bits and the engagement of the client. For PopMart, you had Monica Caston, I think, doing video directing, and various other people involved who were flexible enough, adaptable enough to know that they weren't going to get weeks of rehearsals, which is what people usually get on these tours.
Right.
Instead, they were going to have to get the screen in their hands at the last minute and improvise like crazy people. And so you need the people in the sort of the content side who can work within those parameters, and then you need a client who's understands that that's what's going on, that the show's going to change every single night for the first week or two or three as your creative team gets a handle on what the system is capable of. And those clients are incredibly unusual. So.
And back in 1996, I talk about it like it's, eons ago, but there wasn't email, there wasn't, phone conversations, now, I don't know how your creative teams, talk, usually creative teams are in the same room, and you get the most out of them that way because you can go back and forth. I mean, how are you finding it to manage creative teams these days?
I mean, first of all, I don't really manage creative teams. I think when I am brought into something, it's usually a conversation about an idea.
Mm-hmm.
and I'm being brought in as a specific resource.
Mm-hmm.
So my role tends to change over time in these things. But we're doing some projects now where everybody is all over the world. We just had a test for a conference called Framework that's going to come up in June, that's focused on more on the content side. And we have a Slack, and we're playing with various video conferencing and meeting apps, trying to find a way to do this conference. But there's Laura Frank, who's driving the conference, is in Kyoto. There's people in London. There's people in Portugal. There's people in, well, all over the U.S. And everybody's or the people who are involved in managing the show are all on Slack, and it's mostly Slack and video chat and just trying to keep experimenting and trying to see what works and what doesn't work in that environment. And it's a very narrow project, but Slack is almost I haven't done a project in a while at any scale that doesn't use that to some degree as a tool. And then it's all shared cloud storage and Google Docs, Google Sheets. So I think what's happened is the creative community on a lot of these big shows is already dispersed. There's offices that have like people who used to be together before the pandemic. But the overall production as a whole, in my experience, most of the stuff we've been doing in the last, it feels like forever,
Mm-hmm.
has involved people who were not co-located. And I think there's a penalty for that. You know, you don't go out to drinks after work and have conversations and have an aha moment.
Mm-hmm.
But what that means is that these people are already, or this community is already somewhat well set up for this moment where we're finding ourselves in. It's just that there's no work. But.
Right. Exactly. Is WorldStage, and are you looking at, like, I see a lot of people talking about gaming platforms and kind of interactivity. Is any of that stuff part of what you're working on?
Well, gaming platforms have been part of what we're doing for a really long time. I think I first got a Unity license in 2011, maybe 2010. You know, to me, game engines are the operating system for what's coming next. You know, that's sort of coalesced around this idea of the metaverse. And so you have AR, you have VR, you have XR, you have mixed reality. At some level, we're headed towards a future where the digital is omnipresent, and tons of that's going to be passive, and some of it's going to be active, and there will always be people who think VR is the next big thing. And I don't tend to buy that. But I think XR and virtual production workflows are going to be not just tools that are here for people to use in film production, but things that we find ourselves using more in daily life in various ways. So the fact that particularly XR and stuff like that is suddenly a thing during this pandemic is not really surprising. I know WorldStage started work on that probably 2 years ago. So there's a ton of work already done on that, sort of that platform internally within WorldStage. But the rest of it, virtual meetings, finding ways to improve the production value of Zoom calls, so maybe people won't feel like their corporate event is going to look like their after school parent meetup. It's I think there's lots of things we can do there, and there's also a huge middle ground between Zoom and whatever else people are using, and a full-on XR production like the Katy Perry video.
Mm-hmm.
There's a ton of stuff there in the middle that is going to be interesting and compelling and will look way better than just your average Zoom presentation. It's just people have to figure out how to get there. I know the guys at Notch are doing a ton of work on that, are thinking about it. I know a lot of people are like trying to find a way to sort of add a programming layer to this, add a layer of environment and place and design to the sort of sterile sort of sea of boxes that we're all getting used to seeing on our screens.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the general public of event goers, like the audience, can expect coming out of this?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think there's sort of two things we know. One is that we are going to return to some degree of normalcy at some point, that things are going to get back to where they were largely. But the other thing we know is that there's a few things that will always be different. I think we're all worried about sort of these seismic shifts, that there's going to be some radical change and nothing will go back to the way it was. And then there's another cohort of people who are 100% convinced that everything will return to exactly the way it was before. And this is just going to be this, weird blip. And I think in my mind, it's going to be more like sort of some Back to the Future movie where somebody accidentally changed one thing and history looks really real, or sorry, the future will look very, very normal, but there'll be something slightly different. There'll be one different thing there as a sort of a hangover from the pandemic. Because I think it's very hard to change that culture of going to concerts, going to big public events, going to big sporting events. There's a huge motivation to get back to that. But at first, we're going to discover some other fun things in this that we will carry forward, because it'll be a thing we have. We only have corporate health insurance because of World War II, and a desire for companies to have some way of negotiating with employees when wages had been frozen by the federal government, and here we are years and years later, we still have corporate health insurance. Mm-hmm. There's things that are going to change in this that people are going to like, and those things are going to be locked in. I hear a lot of people who are actually stunned by how much they value the family Zoom calls, family video calls. That this is something that they just didn't want to do, but now it's become a regular part of their lives. So in terms of people going to shows, what are they going to see? I haven't got a clue. The one thing I feel fairly confident about is that designers are going to be looking for new tools, and that a lot of them will have spent this time playing around with software and playing around with new tools. And so we'll see some sort of changes in scenic and in design, just because the designers have had a moment off. But I also think they're going to want something new visually, new things in terms of video displays, new things in terms of lighting, and they may look at the audience as more of a part of the show now, because just the idea of having an audience again is going to be a self-conscious thing.
Using the audience, like I think when you were talking about David Bowie and video as a character and the audience as a character, I think those are two really interesting, especially video as a character in the show. I think that's an interesting concept. Where do you draw your inspiration from?
God, that's another question that leaves me a bit stumped. I think so much of where we come from has to do with what we consumed when we were younger. As a kid in high school, as a student in college, I was looking at sort of theater design, Joseph Sobota, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, the Bauhaus, various old sort of artistic movements. But it was more attitude than anything else. But I think the whole coming out of a punk rock scene and working in the theater made me less afraid of messing around with the technology. The fact that my dad bought Heathkit stuff and forced me to learn to solder. It's like, do I solder much? Almost never. But I've lost my fear of electronics. Taking things apart is a ritual, that I've been doing for ages, which is why I understand the display stack at LCD monitors, which is why I understand the basic sort of how LED systems work, what the basic building blocks are, and how you can rearrange them. And so it's just constantly exposing yourself to stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But on the other end of it, having conversations with designers and people on the creative side, people on the content side, and just being open to all that, because there's going to be connections between something somebody says and something you took apart and something you read and something you saw at a show. So I think it's that mix of stuff and just constantly doing that, which means reading technical blogs and having conversations with engineers from display companies and lighting companies that go way over my head, and being okay with that.
It's good advice, actually, for producers. I look at your articles, and again, I think they're really, really interesting, and technical wise, I guess. Like you say, sometimes it may go over your head, but to me, it impacted me. What can producers do at this point to not be afraid of the technology, to embrace it, and to move forward with new and amazing things?
Have conversations with your technical partners early on, but don't attach names to things. So I had a conversation with somebody I really respect yesterday, and he was relating to me something he picked up at a design company, which was you don't name things. Mm-hmm. Don't name things in the conversations with the client, because the moment you name things, it's now a little baby, and you have to take care of it.
Okay. So you mean like concepts, like don't give, like, is that what you mean?
It's concepts. Don't name the concepts, but also don't necessarily name the technology.
Okay.
Keep the conversations open and less concrete. There's a rush, and I've had this inclination, but I've never really been able to articulate it.
Mm-hmm.
But when we have a conversation with a client and they say, we're going to put an LED screen here, my initial reaction is almost always to push back against that, because it's not that there shouldn't be a screen there, but the more you commit to the technology, the more specific you get when you're talking about what you're going to do in a space, from a execution point of view, the more boxed in you are in terms of what you actually can do, because clients will buy into that. You know, if we say that, the client may go back and say there's going to be an LED screen, and now we can't change that, because if we change that, the end client is going to go, where did the LED screen go? You know, and so having these conversations early so the technical people understand the context of what is being done, what is being asked, what is desired, having those conversations early, but trying to avoid specificity, trying to avoid committing yourself too early to a specific approach, because you don't have to. You've been brought in early enough that you don't have to say, well, this is absolutely this, you know, which is hard for the technical people. That's hard, partially because whoever runs the company wants to know what they're going to be renting,
right,
what they're going to be selling, and, you know, what is the revenue forecast, all this stuff. But if you have the time, you don't need to commit, but you can get a sense of what the artistic vision is, what the creative vision is, what's the story they're trying to tell. If you can, you know, get all that done, then you have a better understanding of what's possible, and you can point out to people options that they may not be thinking of. That's always a wrestling match, and I think there's a lot of clients out there who are concerned about getting billed for the time.
Yeah.
Or wasting people's time because it's too early and the client hasn't signed off on something, and the creative is still in flux. And it's like, in my mind, there's never a good reason not to have a conversation.
I agree. I think sometimes, especially with corporate shows, and this is what my background is, with corporate shows and corporate clients, they want to actually have something concrete. They like that and they react off it. And I think that speaks to your point. You know, they want to be they want you to consult them as to how the group can execute a certain project. How do you kind of walk that line? And also a lot of times you're impacted and restricted by the physical space that you're in. So,
well, I think every client is not every client is different, but everybody handles information differently. And as much as I'm saying, you know, don't name things, maintain flexibility, there's absolutely clients for whom that just isn't their happy place. That isn't a system that works for them. They need to tie things down. They need to understand from the first conversation exactly what is in each area. I mean, you know, that's part of the business. I mean, that's a big part of the business. You know, I hate to say something and then diminish the value of it in like, you know, the next sentence. But, you know, the reality is that I may only be talking about 5% or 10% of the business, because a lot of things we do are already sort of pre-baked. You kind of, you know, if you've been doing a show for 10 years, if you really know exactly what the client wants. What I'm suggesting may not be terribly relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it's the important thing is to be able to read the room, read the client, understand like what that person wants, because it's not my show.
Right. Right. And I think you're right. I think, there's a certain percentage, and it's the bigger, more spectacular, and this is just in my mind, the concerts and the people who are looking for the edgy stuff where you can go in and say, you don't want to be boxed in, you want to create the event rather than be told how the event needs to be created. Do you think collaboratively? So again, I'm going through LinkedIn and I'm looking at all the different types of people who exist in the events business, and it's just amazing to me the amount of people. There are a small group of people who are kind of in your position. Do you find that you all kind of collaborate, or is there less collaboration than you'd like to share ideas in order to push our industry forward?
No, I think people in my position collaborate almost zero. It's it's a funny industry, and to a degree, there's I think a battle between people who want to retain some sort of competitive edge by wrapping up everything in a black box, and people who want to blow it all up and publish all the resources and stuff like that. There's a guy named Blair Neal who works for Fake Love in New York,
Mm-hmm.
and Blair publishes these blog posts, and I find them I'm incredibly conflicted towards them.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, it's a treasure trove of information on exactly how you can achieve certain effects, how you can make a decision on what type of display system you want to use, where the various vendors are for these displays. That information used to exist in my head and a few other people's heads, and Blair is going out there wantonly making it accessible to everyone. And there's an element of me that finds that terrifying.
Mm-hmm. But
I also gave him all my resources for custom display hardware.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It goes back to that comment earlier about like inspiration and what keeps you going. And, at a certain point, I just decided that, if I've found this vendor and I think they're good and I've done that, then, throw them work.
Yeah.
It's like that's now a known thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably a known thing before I discovered it. And now that I've quote discovered it, it's done its job for me.
Mm-hmm.
That my goal is not to sit there with a Rolodex that nobody else has.
Mm-hmm.
It's to actually continually unearth new things and try to articulate new capabilities to my clients. And so I've really come around to sort of what Blair is doing, and to a degree, I'm hoping in this series of LED articles in LinkedIn that I'm doing, that I'm exposing some of the history of the industry and some of the things that are sort of getting lost, because that provides greater context for the people who are just getting into the industry, meaning they've only been involved for a decade.
Yes.
That there's other resources and other possible paths forward, and maybe that helps reframe how some vendors approach things. Maybe it helps clients understand why something is a certain way now, and that if they wanted something different, they can go back and look at some of the older stuff and see where maybe it could have forked off in a different direction. I think the public conversations are useful, but I don't think the rental and staging industry in particular has ever been very good at sharing information. So
interesting. It's it's an evolving thing, and it impacts me similarly. So I kind of have the same thought process you have. What I'd like to do is, if people want to read your articles, you're on LinkedIn, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So it would be, is it Matthew Ward, or it's Matt Ward, right? On LinkedIn, I think. Yep. I've got your page right open here. So it says Matt Ward, Chief Technologist at WorldStage. So all your articles are there. If someone wanted to get in touch with you, Matt, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
I think LinkedIn is a good start in sending a message there.
Okay, great.
They can certainly send an email to the WorldStage account.
Okay.
Which is matthew.ward, MATTHEW.ward @worldstage.com.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a wicked spam filter. So.
Well, as a technological company, I would expect no less. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today, Matt. It's the technology behind events is going so fast, and have somebody to talk to who can enlighten us on that and give us some insight on it is really cool. So thank you again for taking the time to be on Event Yak.
No, thanks for having me on.
Well, that's a wrap for this show. Hey, you can show us some love by subscribing to the show wherever you're listening to us. Subscribing is caring. You can also find us at eventyak.com. The opinions expressed on Event Yak are the opinions of our individual guests and not necessarily the organizations to which they're affiliated. Event Yak is a production of Moonfish Production Limited. Thank you for listening. Be kind, be safe, and stand by to stand by.